And welcome to Bringing Up Baby, discussion between Emma Donoghue, novelist, Sir Michael Rutter, scientist. This event's being held, as you will know, since you're here, by the Royal Society as part of their summer exhibition. It is in association with the Royal Society of Literature. It is being recorded, so if you're tempted to scream or shout, maybe you should leave the room if you want to do that first. In case of a fire, I've been told that that's the exit to choose. In case you need the loo, that's the exit to choose. Now, my name is Susannah Herbert. I used to be editor of News Review on the Sunday Times. I welcomed this opportunity because as a journalist, I'm used to mugging up very fast on things in which I know nothing at all. So as far as I'm concerned, I'm almost part of the audience here. I'm going to be learning as much as you are from these two remarkable, creative people. The talk is going to last, the series of talks, I suppose, is going to last till about 5:30, and we're structuring it as follows. First of all, Emma will talk for about 20 minutes, and then Mike will talk for about 20 minutes, and then they will engage each other, and then you will be able to ask questions. So if during the discussion or the monologues you want to make a note of something you want to ask later, please do, and I'll try to be as fair as possible and get as many of you in as possible. Now, I'm going to start by introducing Emma as the author of this book. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. There's very few greater honours than that, other than perhaps being the winner. I asked her when we met today if she could tell me how many copies she had sold, and her reply was, after 1 million, they stopped telling you. So you can gather, A, that she's pretty cool about things like numbers, and B, this book has had the most enormous influence, not just among literary folk, people who read Booker-listed novels, but also among really a huge mass readership. And her postbag, which she told me about a little, has been absolutely incredible. And it has included people who work with children, people who work in prisons, and many people who see the book as an allegory of whatever they are going through at the time. So it's more than one thing. This is a book which really is many things to many people. Now, on my right, it's going to be very difficult summarising Professor Sir Michael Rutter in a few words because he spans so many disciplines. I suppose the thing to remember is that he is the father of child psychiatry in this country. His work spans a number of disciplines. Here we go. He's the professor of developmental psychopathology at the Institute of Psychiatry. When I asked him to explain in plain English what this actually meant, he said he looks at development in relation to norms, to normality and disorder. And I asked him, trying to narrow it down a little bit, so where does development begin and end? And he said around the age of 90 it slows down a bit. So as you can see, he's professor of everything, of all of us. What I find most heartening about his research is that he has established that your brain's plasticity is not fixed. It doesn't stop when you stop developing externally. I say he established this, he's worked on this, but he has many very heartening things to say about how young people's brains develop and how they might be affected by experiences as superficially, I suppose, traumatic as those described in Emma's book. Now, before I eat any more into the time, I'm going to hand you to Emma to speak about rum.
Thank you. I'm going to attempt to set the stopwatch on this to give me some feeling of when my time is running out. I'm honoured to be here. I have shared platforms with scientists before, but only with each of us talking about our own thing. I've never actually engaged in public debate with one. And although it's a great pleasure, it also makes me aware of literature's inferiority complex vis-a-vis science, that I immediately felt, he'll know everything, I'll know nothing. So perhaps it's more like literature is the little sister who suspects she's prettier and deeper than the big sister, but still can't quite compete at the level of hard facts. So I'm going to try to play to my strengths today and be aware that a novelist is really never claiming authority on any subject. I think all novelists can do is see perhaps unexpected links, or occasionally use story to synthesize things, but we're not really experts on any one area. I wrote Room. Many people assume that I wrote it in order to create a sort of thrilling true crime drama, and that's not true at all. I happened to hear about the Fritzl case, and I immediately thought, a child who had spent his first 5 years in a locked room, as the Austrian child Felix Fritzl did, he would be an extraordinary kind of alien come to Earth if he emerged into our world. And in particular, I saw that some journalist had asked Felix Fritzl what he thought of the world, and apparently the answer was that it was nice. And I immediately thought, that journalist must have put words in that child's mouth. I can't believe that what he thought of our world was merely nice. So really, that's what inspired Room. But the reason the idea hooked me in the first place is that at the time I had, my children were 4 and 1, and I was so immersed in that crazy trip that is early parenthood. I was so struck by both the thrilling and the grinding aspects of mothering that I think I was immediately seized by the notion of writing a novel in which a very peculiar story about a child really like no other, would in fact be a way of bringing up the everyday questions that every single parent faces. I mean, you can't get your children 10 yards down the road without having to decide whether you'll prioritize their safety or their freedom. Every ice cream, you're thinking, it's a moment of great pleasure, but it's bad nutrition. We're constantly on that knife edge of safety belt, yes, helmet, yes, but perhaps I'll let them cross the road on their own. So the kind of issues that Ma in my novel, who gives birth to her kidnapper's child at the age of 19, the kind of questions she has at the grand level, we all have every day with any child in your care, whether it be a nephew or grandchild or a child you're working with. So Room, then, the weird storyline for me was just a way of shining a spotlight on actually the issues of ordinary childhood. But of course, to research it, I had to read a lot about things done to children and, to put it very crudely, what they can survive and what they can't. And in particular, I read up on every case I could find of vulgarly called feral children raised in weird isolation from the world. Now, I should start by saying that Jack in my book is an absolute best case scenario. He's not meant to be typical of anything. I imagined a situation in which a child would be growing up in a locked room, but nothing else would be bad. So he's got vitamin pills. He's got perfect, energetic young mother. I mean, I was writing this novel at about 39, thinking, okay, let's just imagine that the young woman has all the time I don't, the complete unbroken focus on her child that I have failed to commit to my children. Let's just imagine that this woman has energy and imagination and all these gifts, and that there's nothing else to cheer her up except this child. She's a kidnap victim. She's being raped every night or two. So let's imagine that she's put all she has into motherhood. What might the results be? So on the one hand, Jack is having a great childhood. On the other hand, he's having an appalling childhood. So in a way, what I was creating was a kind of a test case for the question of whether one great parent might be all you need. So it's not a typical story of an abused or neglected child at all. And I don't think there is any one Jack in the world. Because, for instance, all the cases I looked at where children had weird childhoods, they're usually damaged by them. A childhood in which no adult speaks to you, you're going to be stunted. A childhood in which you're constantly hit, you're going to be really damaged. So the Jack in my book is a one-off. It's not that he's unrealistic, but I would say he's a completely imaginary case. So I tried to make it very plausible, but it's a plausible account of possibly an impossible situation in which basically his mother tries to meet every possible need he has for the first 5 years. So I did read about kidnap cases, of course, and about some of the very, resilient traits you see sometimes in kidnapped victims. Very few of them have had children, by the way. There have only been a handful of examples worldwide that we know of. But the amazing ways in which they use what they've got. Elizabeth Fritzl used to get her children to watch a program about nature, and then she'd turn it off and get them to write a little essay based on what they remembered. And, one of her children did a picture of a blue octopus, which she stuck up on the wall. So this kind of amazing, chipper homeschooling attitude found in kidnapping victims, just astonishing. But I also read about many other situations that struck me as in some ways analogous to how Jack would be growing up. I didn't want to focus it on crime at all. In a way, I wanted to resist the captor's terms by making this not the story of a kidnap or the story of rape, but Jack's story of childhood. I wanted Jack and his ma to set the terms of what the narrative would be. So I read a lot about situations in which, say, a child might be in a awful Romanian orphanage and then adopted suddenly into a much more comfortable and loving situation, and how children, might not have the ability to run around, and then when they're put in the right situation, these abilities flourish almost overnight. I read a lot about refugee situations, and again, the astonishing adaptability of children. I remember one newspaper article where I live in Canada about a family who had just arrived from Haiti, and the parents were sitting sort of stunned under a tree, and their kids were already playing soccer with the locals. So that almost frightening ability children have to adapt and adjust and get on with it. So I also read a lot about families and what makes families work well. And there was some very interesting research about it not being the externals that matter to families. It's not whether there's a father, a mother, a child. It's not whether they have a house. It's more things like, does that family have a sense of ritual? Whatever the ritual may be, whether it's the big Sunday dinner or whether it's on Tuesday night we skip. What matters is some sense of comforting rhythm and predictability for the child. And I think children can adjust to almost any rules so long as they know that there's a logic to those rules. Maybe in grandma's house we never mention the war. Maybe in auntie's house we always wear blue. But if these rules are predictable, then a child can work within them. And I read a lot about prisoners too. Very interesting work that's been done on the long-term effects, say, of solitary confinement. The irony is you don't need to study what psychopaths do in order to look at this kind of damage. You can look at what, say, the US government does in gigantic numbers. So there's a lot of evidence available for what it does to people to lock them up alone. And one moment in the book, for instance, where after her release, Ma cracks up, many people said to me, oh, that's an improbable element. But that, in fact, was based on reading I did about the delayed effects of solitary confinement, that often people only have a breakdown when they're either back in the general prison population or when they've been released. So I read very broadly, as I'm suggesting. I didn't become a specialist in any one area, but I read about many different situations that seemed to me to offer any sort of wisdom into what Jack might be going through. And in a way, I tried to approach Jack and his ma, who has no name in the book because Jack insists on thinking of her as Ma. I tried to approach them almost anthropologically rather than medically. I didn't want to see them as victims, and so I thought of them as a little island culture. I thought of them a bit like, castaways, that here she is in this situation bringing up this child with all that she can remember and all that she can bring to this. So it's not a nature versus nurture story. It's more like, she's using all her instincts to raise Jack right, but she's also teaching him Kylie Minogue songs. She's teaching him whatever is in her head. She's teaching him the sort of remnants of the Christianity she was vaguely given. She's teaching him using, say, folk tales. She's in a way passing on anything to Jack that can give him a sense of agency, some idea that there are forces of good and evil and that you might be able to overcome the evil. So she's teaching him everything she can that won't make him feel like a random and helpless victim of outside forces. And that was something else I found in my reading about families and what makes families work. A sense of being able to tackle your problems. A sense of being able to change. Changes happen. A parent might go out to work, and so the patterns will all be different, and maybe it'll be granny who picks you up from school. But a successful family will adjust to that kind of thing. Families are always, in a way, remaking themselves and adjusting the roles slightly. So it was an absolutely fascinating research project because, I was writing about a kind of a nowhere, this room in Middle America that could have been anywhere. And yet it needed me to read up about so many different living situations worldwide. One thing I hardly needed to read up on because I'm so in the middle of it socially is attachment parenting. I would say is the strong philosophy around these days, especially in the circles I move in. So I had one friend who, for instance, breastfed her child till 5. Now, in the book, I had her breastfeeding Jack till 5 because they're in a locked room together. I thought that was the kind of circumstances that would make her likely to say, this is working, why mess with it? But I had a friend who did it anyway. So I know friends on the whole spectrum from, Ferberize them and get them sleeping through the night at 6 months, right through to breastfeeding till 5. And I'm very interested in the pros and cons of this kind of attachment philosophy we've got nowadays. I would say I'm about, halfway along that spectrum myself, in that I carried my babies in a sling, but I could never sleep with them. So I was just very interested in the ways in which Ma and Jack, being so physically close to each other, might be an enormous kind of comfort and consolation and safety to him, but it would also mean that they are effectively like a mother and a newborn. So I thought, if you then, in the second half of the book, put them in the outside world, he won't know the first thing about how to survive without her if she goes into the next room. So this book, in a way, was a way for me to look at the most ordinary and everyday facts of being a child and being a parent, and speculate on how that might play out in this particular weird situation. When I had my kids, I would have thought that I was never going to write about parenting, because I felt everything I was feeling had been felt by everybody else a million times before. But I think having a peculiar enough storyline in Room was a way of, in a way, looking at this very banal material, but in a way that makes it new. Because questions like, at 5, is your child able to remember a set of instructions? In the context of the storyline in Room, this becomes literally a life or death issue. The question of, how much responsibility a child could take. What should you have taught your child? What qualities do you need to have given your child for them to survive? In the case of Jack in Room, it's a literal survival we're talking about. So for me, it was a fascinating project. And let's just see if I rabbited for 20 minutes already. No, apparently not. In a way, for me to talk about the research I did is misleading, because I approached it primarily as a literary task, meaning I thought a lot about the novel as, say, a child's eye novel. And one reason that Jack in the book, he's got very few books. I doled out only 5 books to him. I still feel bad about that. But one of the books he happens to have in a cheap edition from a supermarket is Alice in Wonderland. Because not only is that such a great book on the strangeness of childhood experience, in which, you always feel too big or too small, and things are always changing around you with the dream logic of a situation in which you're completely helpless. So not only is Alice in Wonderland that, but it's got whole chunks of child's eye perspective in there too, where Lewis Carroll would actually let Alice narrate, her thoughts as she's falling down the rabbit hole. So I saw this book very much in the tradition of child's eye fiction. And I think child's eye is always a very, very useful way to write about, for instance, horror. There have been some very good books that approach something like the Holocaust freshly through child's eye. I'm thinking, say, of The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. But also child's eye is very good on sex and how odd it is to somebody who's outside it. So I'm thinking of novels like, say, L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between, Roddy Doyle's Paddy Clark, Ha Ha Ha. Novels in which children don't understand what's going on between the grown-ups are a very good device for sort of defamiliarizing sex and saying, how crazy these motives and preoccupations would look to somebody who doesn't understand what sex is about. I also, because I'd done my PhD in 18th century literature, I also thought of Room in the tradition of those 18th century novels narrated by a sort of naive social commentator like, say, Voltaire's Candide or Swift's Gulliver's Travels, in which a kind of a wide-eyed child would comment on our world and see it again strangely and newly. I never wanted this book to be one more contribution to our obsession with the psycho killer. So I never wanted the kidnapping scene, the first rape scene, the dungeon sex scene. I deliberately left all that out. I think for anyone who's interested in the perspective of a captor, John Fowles' novel The Collector, which I read in my teens and scared me silly, I think that's still the ultimate example of that. But I didn't want to give the captor in my book the respect of scenes from his perspective, or even him shaping the terms. I don't take the story on to his court case, for instance. I couldn't care less about his court case. I deliberately kept him at arm's length, just like the mother in the book did. I didn't want it to be a book about him in any way. So, yeah, another way in which I would say Room is very much a literary book is that it has elements of the fabular. I saw the first half in particular very much as a fairy tale, and in a way in the second half they kind of fall into realism more. In the first half, not only is Jack called Jack, but his mother constantly reads him folk tales and tries to give him that sense that, you know, he's the heroic underdog of so many folk tales, in which the boy who has nothing but quick wits still manages to defeat the ogre. The book has a lot of kind of mythic elements. And in particular, one text I found very inspiring, which I quote in the epigraph, is a very, very ancient poem in the voice of Danae. She is a walled-up virgin who gives birth to the hero child Perseus, and at a certain point they are set afloat in a boat as a sort of way of killing them. You know, they're sent off to sea in a boat, and there's this ancient poem in which she's speaking to him, and she's basically saying, this is a crude paraphrase, "Look at you sleeping. You know, you're sleeping so easy, you have no idea." You know, so I loved the idea that, you know, in this dramatic storyline, only the mother would really know what's going on, would really know all the sorrows and what her child has been missing and the dangers ahead. The child is sleeping like a baby. So I loved the sense that these two people are living through the same thing, but they're really living through two different things, because she has all the burden of the knowledge and all the burden of knowing about the past and of knowing about other lives he could have lived. And she is sort of sorrowing over her child and her child's innocence, but yet his innocence is an enormous kind of protection as well. So, you know, for a fairly simply written, slim novel, you can see that I threw a lot in there. But I would certainly say it was the most wonderful experience, because, like you were mentioning, I get fan letters in which it's not so much that they're raving about my prose, not at all. It's more that I see how much readers bring to each book, because I get novels from America where people say, you know, I was raised by a certain religious group and it was just like that. Or I grew up very poor and we didn't have any friends and it was just like that. I remember one woman writing to me to say that she, you know, got out of her violent marriage, but now she has to accept that her children still treasure some of the memories of that upbringing, even though to her they're like, you know, something she would prefer to banish. Then I get letters from Iran and China saying, thank you for your political allegory. It describes conditions in my country perfectly. So everyone brings their own stuff to this book. And I feel immensely lucky that I happened to hit on a subject which people would care about so much. Yeah, that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. I'm going to turn to Professor Sir Michael Rutter now, because although he, like me, has read the book, what he was originally asked to do when this event was mooted was to come and to talk about basic science advances in relation to brain science and development. Now, his own field has included close study of the Romanian orphans, so there's little he doesn't know about deprivation and its effects. But bear in mind that this is not set up as a gladiatorial combat. You know, we're not saying this is art, this is science, one is right, one is wrong. But I think, like me, you would like very much to know what science and close evidence, study of the evidence, has brought to the issues which Emma has just raised.
Right, thanks very much. Well, very glad to be here. And I think that we will see as the afternoon goes on that although Emma and I come from very different backgrounds, some of the questions she has posed are similar to those that I've been concerned with. And so let me start by just saying a word on that, so that if we go back several decades, researchers, scientists tended to focus on the structure of the family. And broken homes, single-parent families were, all the weight was being placed on those. As scientists, one always wants to put one alternative against another one. And with broken homes, just to take one example, that was done by people like David Ferguson, using the Christchurch longitudinal study, asking were the risks for antisocial behaviour, which is what he was particularly interested in, a function of discord in the family or breakup of the family. And in a word, what he found was that if you pitted one against the other, it was clearly the discord and conflict which created the main risk. And George Brown did somewhat similar things, but looking at depression as an outcome, with, again, it's not the breakup that does the damage, it's the things that go with it. So George and his colleagues were talking particularly about the quality of parenting. Now, to bring it much more up to date, similar questions now are raised in relation to adoption by lesbian couples, by gay couples, and by heterosexual couples. And Susan Gollenbach at Cambridge has been studying this and comparing them in a very systematic way and asking what matters. And to cut a long story short, the answer is, so far, there is surprisingly little difference among these three groups. They have in common adoption. They are very different in the sense of dealing with gay families or lesbian families or heterosexual families, but it's the quality of parenting that was the thing that mattered. And so out of all of that, I think what I would somewhat oversimplify is by saying that it boils down to a focus on the importance of conversation and play in upbringing, and the importance of consistent, loving relationships. Those aren't the only things that matter, but certainly those are two very important ones. And I think that in thinking about the book, it's useful to focus not, as Emma Glee wanted to avoid focusing on, the dramatic abduction and rape, but on what in specific was the problem with the upbringing as experienced. Now, in terms of the science, there are three areas where science has moved on rapidly and dramatically that I want to focus on. The first is the biological embedding of experiences, by which I mean that experiences have effects on the body, including the brain, and that if the effects of experiences last longer than the experience itself, something must have happened in the biology to lead to that persistence. And a lot of different things have been looked at. One of them is epigenetics and its effects on gene expression. So the genes that you all have, that we all have, are there from birth. Well, actually they're before birth, and they do not change during the lifetime. But genes only have effects when they're so-called expressed, and the expression of genes is influenced through epigenetic mechanisms by experiences as well as chance happenings. And that has meant that the idea that genes don't change, it's only environments that change, we've had to get rid of. It's actually more complicated than that, and environments change the expression of genes and therefore the effects of genes. Now, it's not just looking at epigenetics though, so there are effects on the neuroendocrine system, the so-called HPA axis, which is concerned with responses to stress and adversity. And we know that the effects of single acute stresses is quite different from those of chronic adversities. Both, however, do have effects. And then there are neural effects, the effects on brain growth itself, so that in the study of Romanian adoptees that been mentioned, one of the things we looked at was the effects on brain growth. And we were unusual in being able to look at the effects of deprivation where there was not subnutrition, because the two tend to go together. And what we found was that the effects on brain growth of pure psychosocial deprivation were negligible in the first 6 months of life, but they were huge thereafter. And we need to ask with all of these, are these permanent effects or not? And the answer is, well, yes, but no. Yes, in the sense they are very persistent, but they do go on changing. So that they're not permanent in that respect, so that in our own study, the effects on head growth, which is an index of brain growth, were still going on, recovery was still going on between the ages of 11 and 15. So it's an interesting view of development now that has been forced upon us by the scientific findings, being much more flexible than we used to think. Which leads on, of course, to brain plasticity. Now, what that means is plasticity being the ability of the brain, or for that matter, any part of the body, of adapting, and plasticity is whether a brain can adapt. Now, the science has started by asking the question, would it be good if we had total plasticity, or is that bad? And the answer, of course, has to be, well, if there was total plasticity, you'd have no stability of functioning. So that clearly would be bad. On the other hand, if you had no plasticity, you couldn't adapt to changing circumstances, and that would obviously be bad. And so there are scientists like Takao Hench in Harvard who is looking at what is involved in plasticity at a molecular level. What are the brain mechanisms involved? And he talks about, in relation to his own findings and those of others, that we need to be concerned with brakes and accelerators, and that a well-functioning organism, as it were, can do it either way. There are things that can change this, such as drugs, so that SSRIs, for example, the antidepressants, have an effect on increasing plasticity. Experiences have effects on plasticity, so that it's not that plasticity is a given, it's that it's there in all of us. It, of course, lessens as you grow older, but it extends right into adult life. And the study, I guess, that most people know about these days is the taxi driver study by Eleanor Maguire and her colleagues, of looking at how London taxi drivers who have to learn what's called the knowledge, meaning all routes to all places around London, which is a formidable memory task, is associated with measurable changes you can pick up in brain scanning in the hippocampus, so that an increase in the posterior and a decrease in the anterior. And so that was not an experimental study, but Eleanor Maguire went on to ask, well, what happens when taxi drivers retire? And the answer is, well, it sort of reverts to somewhere nearer people who've not learned the knowledge, but there are remnants remaining. It's sort of halfway house. The initial study had focused on the difference between taxi drivers and bus drivers and found huge differences. Although they covered similar routes, they didn't have to know all of that. But then the focus tended to be thought of initially, not by her, I should emphasize, but by others, that the hippocampus is the one exception to the rule that new growth cannot occur in the brain. But then there were studies of musicians, and musicians similarly in adult life have brain changes, but not in the hippocampus. This is now in the cortex, quite different part of the brain, as a result of having to learn all sorts of intense musical skills. And that was initially just cross-sectional, but then they went on to do that experimentally, and it stood up to the test. And then there was the study of jugglers, of people who were trained to juggle, and then looked at the brain effects. And again, now, once more, like the musicians, not on the hippocampus, but on other parts of the brain. So that brain changes can occur right into adult life. And it's not just the hippocampus. What we don't know at the moment is, well, how far does it extend? How far in other parts of the brain? How far into other kinds of experiences? And that's work in progress. The third and last topic I want to mention is resilience. And this is a term that is applied to people who have either come out of adverse experiences relatively well, or alternatively have recovered unusually well. And the background to this is the huge variation in children's experiences. There are no exceptions to that as far as I'm aware, either in animal studies or in human studies or in naturalistic studies or experimental studies. And in our study of Romanian adoptees, amazing variation in outcome. So the question is, well, what's that all about? And we have some partial answers on that, but they are still partial. What is clear is that resilience is not a trait. This is not something that you have. It affects everything. You may be resilient at some times in your life for some sorts of problems, but not for others. And that if we think of what are the kind of things that matter in building resilience, I will give just two examples. One is the experience of coping well with adversities. And that is shown both in animal models, animal experiments, and in human experiments. Not human experiments, human studies. And so that coping is protective. And what is the medical analogy here? Well, if you want to protect your children from infections, what do? Do you wrap them in cotton wool and make sure they never encounter an infection? Well, no, that would be a disaster. We know it's a disaster because with the volcano in Tristan da Cunha some many decades ago, when the islanders who had not been exposed to common illnesses like flu and measles and so on came to this country, they went down like flies. No, you need to acquire immunity by exposure, either natural exposure or by vaccination. But either way, it's the protection comes from experiencing it and coping well with it. But the recovery brings in a new set of considerations, which is that resilience is associated with new experiences that both cut off the past, i.e. they're quite different from the past, and they offer new opportunities. And what is interesting in the research on this is that the recovery phase can be well after the adverse experience, and that it involves a series of biological mechanisms that play a role. And it's not that some children are invulnerable. That would be a highly misleading way of putting it. But children do vary in their vulnerability or resilience, and that past experiences and new experiences both play a role in how well that works out. So let me rest my case at that point. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Uncle. I suppose the obvious thing to ask from that is whether or not Ma, in your book, was she doing the right thing in the circumstances? Had she studied some of your work? Would she have done things differently?
Because I should clarify, she was in her first year at university when she was snatched, so that was the educational level I was giving her.
Yeah.
You know, never read up on parenting, never planned parenthood, never, you know, read anything like that, never studied science, but she was at first year university level.
Well, I think my comment would be that obviously that was a quite extraordinary experience she had, and one couldn't possibly suggest that was without importance. But there was plenty of interaction, plenty of talk, and there was a warm, committed relationship, so that in some respects he was having good experiences during that time, in spite of the fact that they were bizarrely abnormal.
Yes, I mean, the point is that there's something quite pastoral and idyllic about your book, in a way, Emma, strange as it may sound. It goes back to stone walls cannot a prison make, nor iron bars a cage, or Hamlet's I can be in a nutshell and count myself the king of infinite space. I like that idea as an artistic idea, but I wonder, is it borne out in your knowledge by anything in the real world?
Well, is what borne out in the real world?
That you can emerge more or less psychologically unscathed as having spent key years of your development, in this case 1 to 5?
Well, I know of no real-life examples of the kind in the book. Yes, of course, there's the Fritzl case, but that was a very abusive situation, and not at all protective in the way that the book very nicely describes. So there's really nothing very much to go on there. All I would say is that even with severely abusive experiences, there are children who come through relatively unscathed. Now, that seems quite extraordinary, but that is borne out. And what is still a work in progress, as it were, is determining, well, what enables that to happen? Why do some children go through and survive, and may even be strengthened by it, and others just go down? And that's a very important question. And if we knew the answer to that, we would be in a much better position to intervene sensibly.
I agree that there are really no such cases, because I looked everywhere, you know. Say in the Fritzl case, they had too little oxygen. They were lying around wheezing for breath as more and more of them got born, and there was less and less room. So yeah, in every case I looked at, there were certain horrors and also family complications. Like in the few cases where these children are raised in a kidnapping setting, they usually think of the captor as daddy, and they have all these warm feelings towards the captor, and then suddenly one day daddy is carted off to prison. So a lot of them are far more psychologically painful and complicated than the one in my book. But I would say that we can find many examples of elements of this kind of thing where parents living in poverty nonetheless do a pretty fantastic job of you know, making the best of what they've got. And all sorts of little things stick out in my mind. For instance, a trip to Tanzania I took, and I saw children making the most amazing model cars out of Coke cans. So clearly those children were literally extracting from the detritus, you know, the rubbish of the Western world turning up at their doors, and they were turning it into exactly the toy they needed. And I'm even thinking of I remember watching The Wire, all the series of The Wire, and there's one episode of The Wire in which you see one of the teenage drug dealers making his little brother do his homework every single day and sending the brother off to school, you know, with a bag of crisps, some dreadful lunch, but still the teenage brother was making sure the little brother did his homework. So, you know, even in the most appalling settings, you can see moments where people who are looking after children manage to, as best they can, give them what they need. So in a way, I looked at all those component parts to try and create this particular fable of the perfect mother living in an impossible situation.
In your book, Emma, you make much of the moment when the child discovers, when Jack discovers that the room isn't, as he had been led to believe, the world, that the universe isn't 11 foot square. And I was interested, you made that the main, the main emphasis, that was a huge thing. She tells him to prepare him for the world. Oh, by the way, what I told you about television, that it's all made up, is not true. The cars don't exist just on television. The bunnies and the grass don't exist just on television. They're in real life. And somehow in the book, that is enough to prepare him for his escape. And I wondered, that was obviously necessary for the plot, but is it possible, do you think, to do that? To tell somebody, let alone a child of 5, everything that I've told you is imagined is real?
It's an extreme example in that it's a whole worldview that has to change. One rather brilliant review of the novel said it's a fall into a Copernican universe, where you suddenly realize, oh, it's not flat, it's round. At the universal level, there's some fundamental misapprehension of mine that has now been corrected. But the reason I emphasize so much that moment of what Ma calls unlying is that we all lie to our children in good ways. And before I had children, I didn't think I would. But then as soon as they were born, I realized, in a way, you have to simplify. Like if you're going out shopping for 20 minutes and you're saying to your toddler who's with, say, a friend, you don't say, I'll be gone for 20 minutes. You say, back soon. You simplify. You find yourself passing on the comforting myths you grew up with. Santa Claus, the tooth. My daughter last night, her tooth came out, it was bleeding. And of course, I made a great big fuss about the tooth fairy. And will it be sterling the tooth fairy brings? And the reason is that there's been a slight loss and a trauma. It's frightening when bits of you fall out. And so if that can turn into money, fantastic. So there are good psychological comforting reasons for all these lies we tell our children. So in a way, I just imagined Ma's situation as a more dramatic version of that, that yes, she does deceive him, but do you really imagine her saying to her 2-year-old, lovely world out there, locked door, can't go out? Who would want their child to be aware of everything they were missing and everything they were in danger of? So it struck me as plausible enough that that the simplified way we speak to a 2-year-old would gradually turn into this whole scale myth. And I think that just as children adjust from what they've been told about, say, Santa or the Easter Bunny to the more adult view, I think similarly a child like Jack could get his head around it. And after all, he does find the world quite confusing when he comes out. There are lots of moments in the book where he thinks he knows something, like he's seen cars on television all the time, but the first time he's in a car and another car comes at him, he's convinced it's going to hit him. So I tried to suggest that there's an enormous gap between, our abstract knowledge of something and the sort of hands-on experience, what grass feels like underfoot and how the world seems to hurt when you hit it. Or the first dog he meets, he's been idealizing dogs and he runs up to a dog and it bites his hand. So I tried to put in a lot of those meeting the dog moments where the world is not what he thought it was going to be. And of course, yes, it's all on a very fast time scale in the book. He escapes and everything happens within a matter of weeks. But I tried to make it at least a plausible version of the kind of amazing adjustments that children do make.
Yes. What do you make of that, Mike? The adaptation to reality, which necessarily, because of narrative, has to happen quickly in cases that you're aware of when...
Well, I think that, firstly, with major change of any kind, there are adaptations that have to be made, and those take a little bit of time, so that the psychologist Richard Gregory studied what happened to individuals who had their sight restored. And I sort of somewhat oversimplify, but what they found was that for many people, actually, they preferred being king in the world of the blind than being a pauper in the world of the seeing. Now that, of course, changed as they learned how to cope with the environment. But so adaptations do take time, whatever they are. Are those adaptations stressful? I think usually not. It's the, if you like, the psychological aspects that are more problematic. And that if you look at children who have been moved from pillar to post because of their father's job, for example, on the whole they do okay, although they have disrupted schooling. Provided everything else is all right, that's not a problem. And those of us like myself who moved around a lot, so that until I came to my present place of work, I'd never been longer than 4 years anywhere. Very untraumatic experience. All my experiences were good ones, but they were in different places. And so I think you soon adapt to that. But what you're describing is more complicated. So I think you rightly talked about that.
Well, one of the things that we discussed earlier was your conviction that actually children of that age don't intellectualize things very much. And the narrative in your book, you've clearly got a child who is speaking in a way which is intelligible to readers of every age. He is an amazingly intellectual 5-year-old, I think.
He's been in an intellectual hothouse. I mean, he's never been stuck in front of the telly like my kids are sometimes stuck in front of the telly. You know, he's never been away from his mother, and she's desperate for company. So in a way, I imagined that not just his language, but his thought processors would be quite accelerated by this one-to-one with this lively young woman. Whereas he doesn't know the first thing about, you know, how to share toys at the library, you know. So the things we think of as basic for children in our society, he doesn't know, but he's terribly good at some of the other things. And of course, a first-person narrative is always a kind of representation of what's going on in the mind. It's not how any child or adult would actually speak. But one thing I did try to do was, although I make his sentences coherent enough, I tried to have the pattern of what he mentions when be quite like the way a child thinks. You know, he'll be halfway through some dramatic discussion with his mother about the nature of reality, and then he'll ask for a sandwich. I mean, they make very rapid segues. And in a way, it was in some ways brilliantly easy to write, because I knew exactly what was in this child's head. I knew every object he'd ever touched. It was way easier than writing about a child in modern London, you know, with so many stimuli. So I knew exactly what the elements were and what things Jack had heard of. And every time he sees a new thing, he's able to add that to his collection of mental objects. So yeah, I think you know, Ma would have rubbed off on him enormously because he's her full-time companion. So I think although he would still be making the grammatical mistakes that 5-year-olds do, at the level of vocabulary and concept, I think he would be quite far ahead.
I was very struck by the fact he never once says, "I'm bored."
I think the "I'm bored" attitude is very much a product of our society, where we're constantly like, "Oh, I have to spend 5 minutes sitting on the tube. I need something on my iPad." You know, I think we are really spoiled children collectively. You know, we constantly want entertainment and, you know, buds in our ear playing us something so we don't have to be bored. And I think Jack, in a way, is growing up in a much more almost, you know, wartime childhood of like, "Oh, one apple. Let's peel the apple and make a game with the peel," you know. So his childhood, although I was very inspired by my own son, who was 5 by the time I was drafting it, I tried in a way to deduce from my son what the kind of universals of being a 5-year-old are. You know, their curiosity, their sense of play, and their pragmatism, and the way 5-year-olds will ask you questions about death and reality and so on, but then the next minute they're back to the practical and the hands-on. But Jack in the book has a totally different personality to my son, because my son has been growing up surrounded by plenty of family, plenty of friends, plenty of toys, plenty of food, and so he can afford to say, "I don't like brown pasta." Whereas Jack in the book is, you know, treasuring every bit of spaghetti. So I think it's a fascinating question of how much this, you know, "I'm bored" attitude is purely constructed by a, you know, hyper self-stimulating society.
What do you make of that, Michael? Having been a wartime baby, I'm not giving away any secrets in this. Not a baby, a wartime child. You grew up with no sweets, presumably, like my father's generation. So you are morally superior.
As well as dentally.
Well, I think that coming back from the States in 1944, was a radical shift in the fact that what my mother had carefully saved up as a joint for the family when I got back is less than I would have had on my plate alone in the States. But the adaptation to that took no more than 24 hours. I mean, that's the way it was. So that was not a problem. I think in terms of the intellectualizing, I mean, I agree, that would be unusual, even with a mother who gave all that she gave to the boy. But it's the... I mean, obviously children do think about their circumstances and do conceptualize, so that's not unusual. I think doing it in the particular way shown in the book, which was necessary for the plot, I think, would be unusual. But he's an unusual child with an unusual experience.
Yes, I think one of the things that baffles me, the great unspoken, the elephant in the room, of course, is Big Nick, because he's not Old Nick. He's not at all present deliberately. And that's how we are protected, and that's how the child is protected. Nick hasn't got a voice. We don't properly see him or hear him. But of course, he is... there is a repeated visits. This man has obviously attacked and in turn been attacked by Ma. Think about the way she whopped him over the head with the top of the loo cistern. How does this not affect a child? Basically, you know, I'm quoting Mike from a conversation we had this morning. To be in a brutal, violent conflict is damaging. And Jack, like it or not, it's a slow motion, brutal, violent conflict, but it's still there.
I think one way I approached this was to say to myself, okay, a mother in such a situation, she can't save her child from being in this world, but she can fence off the horror. So little rules like, for instance, she always puts Jack to bed in the wardrobe by 9 o'clock at night so that he's never literally watching her be raped. He's hearing the bed creaking, but he's not seeing it. Now, you might say that's not much of a difference, but I think it is a bit of a difference. She keeps things... She keeps her encounters with Old Nick at a distance. There's rarely any overt fighting. She only hit him over the head once, and that was years before. I can't even remember in the narrative, is it before Jack's born? So basically, she's produced this kind of simulacrum of an orderly domestic setting so that Jack is not suddenly freaked out by random horrors he sees in the middle of the day. You know, really, most nights either Old Nick doesn't visit, or else there are these creaking sounds and he's overhearing a bit of conversation about, you know, did you buy grapefruit? So I think I imagine that the vague, horrifying stuff would be kept vague for him and would be literally out of sight. And that Ma would do everything she could to give the impression of, you know, okay, these rather strange things happen at night, but we're okay. What'll we have for breakfast? Let's count the cereal. And I think children are quite good at not worrying too much over some uneasy element, like things like, I'm thinking of, say, parents worrying over bills. I think a lot of children would have a sense that their parents are worried over money, or that their parents might argue over, or there'd be some drinking. So there are things in their parents' lives that sometimes worry children a bit, and the children are terribly good at going back to playing with Spider-Man. So, of course, Jack has stress in his life, and he has unease, and he has worries about this Old Nick figure. And what's more complicated, of course, is that he's also quite interested in Old Nick, especially when Old Nick brings him a great toy for his birthday. So, you know, I think in a way Jack is starved for other company, so he'd be naturally drawn to anyone he meets. I mean, in a way, his problems in future life might be not so much that he's hiding away from the world, but he'll be going up to strangers and making friends with anyone. So I imagine that Ma would somehow strike a kind of implicit deal with Old Nick of, I will be a good kidnapping slave if you effectively let me have my little kingdom. You know, don't interfere directly in the mother-child relationship. I mean, you know, like I said before, there are no real situations just like this to compare it to. But I almost thought of it as a bad marriage rather than a kidnapping situation. I imagined that, you know, sex slavery had become domesticated, and in a way Old Nick is already being punished by how boring this is. You know, all the thrill has gone out of it. She's griping about the vitamin pills. You know, I wanted to show him almost already punished.
Yes.
And also, I always try to think of old Nick not in terms of sort of, you know, not as some weird fetishist, but more I thought of him like every, you know, ordinary decent Nazi, every slaveholder in the American South, you know, entire populations of people who, through their ideology, have thought it was okay to own other people. And they weren't all psychologically freakish. They were just, they had this ideology that that's what you do. You own the slaves, or you know, process the prisoners through Auschwitz. And, you know, they think of themselves as kind of good guys, you know. So I saw old Nick as in that line, you know, the banality of evil. He thinks he's giving her a fairly good setup here. So again, I wanted to take all the kind of, you know, freakish abnormality out of the situation. I wanted to look at the elements of just plain ordinary ownership of other people in old Nick that make him similar to entire populations who have owned other people.
Yes. What could have happened in this book, just play with the storyline for a while, if it had been a father incarcerated with his son? I mean, there's been a lot written in the past by, of course, John Bowlby about maternal attachment and how mothers are the only people who can look after their babies.
Do you know, I did consider this.
Yeah.
I actually considered all the gender variations. I thought, okay, what if she has a son instead? What if she has 2 children? What if it's a father? And I thought the only difference is that you can't force a man to get pregnant and give birth. That might seem a bit basic, but I thought if it's a child who's been snatched with his father and held somewhere, I think, frankly, that the day-to-day interaction would have been identical. I actually have a fairly gender-neutral view of parenting. I mean, when it's hands-on, when you're the one rocking the child to sleep, I don't think it matters where you got that child or what gender you are. But the idea that the birth of the child happens in the room was crucial to me as a starting point. I loved the idea that the birth of a child was an accidental byproduct of a kidnapping. And yet out of that terrible, you know, further trauma, she's raped, she gives birth, and yet that in a miraculous way turns out to be her salvation. So I wanted Jack to be born there, and you couldn't do that to a man. I even thought of, okay, woman keeps man in shed in her garden, and then I just started to giggle. I couldn't think of a single example, and I thought this just doesn't work. And I considered making Jack a girl, and then I thought, no, I really want him to be a boy, so that you've got a male and a female principal in this little idyllic world. So it's not, you know, women versus men. It's Jack and Ma as in a way, I saw them almost as an Adam and Eve pair, or as a Mary and Jesus pair, you know, that they could somehow represent all of humanity. But yes, you know, in terms of the hands-on stuff, I didn't see all her tender care of Jack as kind of intrinsically female at all. My own experience of parenthood, even though in my relationship I'm the one who gave birth to the babies, but I remember, you know, as each of them was put in my hands, I remember thinking it starts here. That yes, I've had this wonderfully preparatory experience of pregnancy, but you don't really know them. You're not talking to them yet when they're in there. And I remember thinking, if a child was put in my hands and I had to look after this child, the emotions would be produced by their need. Their astonishing vulnerability is what brings out that passionate commitment in us. And I see the fathers, especially of my generation, I see it happen to them too in exactly the same ways. So I really don't see this as a book about, you know, the unique, special maternal bond caused by birth. I see it as a book about any adult stepping up to the plate and saying, I will look after this child. And that's one reason in the second half of the book, the adult who most successfully bonds with Jack is his step-grandfather. I thought, I'm going to choose a good man who has no particular stake in Jack. He didn't know the mother before. He's not even that closely related. He's a newcomer, but he has the knack, you know. So I thought, you know, I wanted to show there that in the second half of the book, it doesn't have to be your birth parent. It doesn't have to be a woman. It can be any adult who says, come here, I'll play Lego with you.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know it's quite relevant to your research.
Yes, well, I agree with the general comments there. So I think parenting is something men and women can do. There are stylistic differences, but I think those sort of pale into insignificant when put up against the many similarities. What is, I think, clear, we need to remind ourselves is that children being brought up in those circumstances are as rare as hen's teeth. But the experience of abuse and neglect is not. I mean, that's all too common. And what is interesting about the way this is portrayed is that it is all split up like this, that yes, it's abusive at one level, and yet there's a good deal of separation off from that. And the mother clearly meant to do that and succeeded to an unusual extent. That, I think, is really very uncommon. I mean, it'd be nice to think it's more common, but it isn't. But I don't think that gets in the way, as it were, of the discussion in the book of what were the important features here.
In a way, all the case studies I read about damaged children who, and it's not strangers capturing them and selling them off with paedophile rings at all. It's their own parents and caretakers, locking them up in the hen house. I found this website with all these different cases of so-called feral children, and it was just the worst bit of research I've ever had to do. There are cases I wish I could forget. And in a way, I wrote Room almost as the opposite of that. Every time I would read a case of a child who nobody spoke to, for instance, children who ended up really unable to learn language because for too many years they were left alone in a locked room on their own. In a way, I wrote Room as the opposite. I thought, okay, this woman is going to give him constant speech and conversation and reflection and analysis, and he's going to be absolutely humanized by language even though he's never been outside. I suppose that shows my own bias, that if you had to pick one great bit of civilization to pass on to somebody would be language. I'd pick that over all the grassy fields that there are. But I in a way, these cases I read were so horrifying in terms of children being made to feel bad. Children left dirty and then rebuked for being dirty and then made to sit on the floor and eat with the dogs because they were dirty. Just the endless tiny ways as well as more obvious ways in which adults can hurt children. It just gave me the shudders, and it left me with this sense of the awesome responsibility of parenthood, that these children who've ended up with you, however they've ended up with you, it really is in your hands to make their life a heaven or a hell. And I mean, most days you tell yourself you're doing well, especially considering all the dreadful cases you've read. But then there are other moments when, your child is in tears because you've chosen to pick that particular fight over one particular tiny thing, and you think, oh, what a monster I am. I am the domestic monster. I'm the captor my child can't get away from. We play out these little dramas in every house in the neighborhood.
Or the other way around.
Well, writing this book made me very aware that in one sense I'm Ma, right, because I'm giving my characters all these happy experiences, and in the other sense I'm old Nick. I'm the one saying they'll only have 10 books in total. I literally shopped for them. I was on IKEA's website picking out cheap sofa beds, that kind of thing. So I had to do all those cold-blooded decisions that the captor in the book had to do. So it makes me realize the writer is always, in a sense, the kind of Old Testament God of their book. They're always doling out punishment and then doling out relief.
Can I just comment in relation to resilience research? In your talking about the book, you talked about providing a sense of agency at one point. And what comes out of the human resilience research very much is the importance of that. So it's not just good experiences, it's that you develop a sense that you have a degree of control over your destiny, and my goodness, you're going to operate that. So that the books that have been written, for example, Touching the Void, which many of you may well have read, the man who, with a broken leg, who landed down this cleft, what he did was in relation to the fact that he did not want to die alone. I mean, it's very interesting that he put it like that. And he very much focused on the next 20 yards, not getting out, although he did get out, because that was a true story, but of control over that. And it comes out similarly of the John McCarthy experience and Brian Keenan, thank you. So I think that is important. Good experiences, yes, but a sense that you can do something about your situation is also very important.
Yes. On that note, I think there are so many good subjects to follow up, and I think it's time that you, the audience, should stick up your hands and tell me. There's somebody in a blue cardigan here, who I think first, someone in a blue dress, and then the lady in the purple trousers.
Thanks. I was wondering if Emma's book could have her work of fiction, could have any role in science. Often you're saying that there's no case like this in reality and you wouldn't want to make one of it. Emma used science a lot in her research, and whether or not there could be a crossover the other way, if it could actually be used in science, or if Emma, when she wrote it, imagined or had a sense that it could contribute to some of the case studies that she was looking at.
I had no such ambitions.
Well, I think that the Nobel Prize-winning biologist Peter Medawar talked about science as requiring telling a story about what might be going on, as well as the testing of that story, and that's a very important combination. So the testing of the story you can't get from the literature. On the other hand, ideas as to what might be happening, you can. So I think that's where there is the interchange.
Lady in blue.
Yeah, I'm afraid I haven't read the book, and I'm very keen to now. I'm curious about the age at which Jack, it sounds like Jack sort of emerges into the world. Did you say it was 5? Yeah, I wondered about that as a choice, and whether, perhaps sort of to both of you, whether that's sort of an age at which people shift from sort of learning from parents and carers to learning from peers, and what sort of prospects Jack might have had in the world if he'd been sort of enclosed for longer.
Good question. I picked 5 because, in a way, it wasn't about how he would do in the outside world. It was more, I was looking for sort of a halfway point between magical thinking and rationality. I wanted a character who, on the one hand, is passionately believing in things like the tooth fairy, and on the other hand, is able to understand things his mother is telling him about, jump down at the second stop sign. So I needed him to be linguistically advanced enough that, that the oral narration would come across as, it would be readable by adults, but would still come across as a plausible representation of his head. But I didn't want him to be too old. I didn't want it to start getting creepy, for one thing. I mean, the physical intimacy of this mother and child, I didn't want it to get remotely prepubertal or have people worrying about incest. I wanted the line between parent and child to be very comforting and clear. And again, if Jack was a bit older, I think he would start to notice much more. He'd guess much more about sex. He'd notice lots of things. So I wanted him innocent and having all this magical thinking, and yet still quite rational. And I remember saying to myself, okay, am I picking 5 just because my son is 5? And then I thought, no, it really is the ideal age for this kind of transitional figure who's, 1 minute very much the baby and another minute almost sounding like an adult, in that his mother is treating him as her peer, and giving him lots of those moments of agency, like, what shall we have for dinner, Jack? She's not just doling it out to him. Nowadays, we very often, tell our children to go off and be children, and we'll take the adult decisions. But if there's only 2 of them together, in a way, they're very much peers. So I thought 5 was the perfect point there, because I wanted it to be that, that within a matter of weeks, she has to go from keeping up this lie about how the world is to suddenly having to tell him all these awful new truths, because he's suddenly asking all these new questions. And I thought 5 was about right for that.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a very reasonable age to have chosen for exactly that reason. All I would say is, it's not a magical point, though. Nothing particular happens at age 5 exactly, but the book obviously demanded something between very early childhood and adolescence, and 5 is as good an age as any.
The lady in the purple trousers.
Thank you. My question is particularly for Professor Rutter. I'm sorry. I had to exclude the author. As we know more about genetics, and particularly epigenetics, how do you think this is going to influence how we bring up children and how we deal with damaged children?
Okay, well, that's an important and interesting question. I don't think that genetics research as such tells us anything very much about the bringing up of children. other than the fact that children are very variable and that any approach to children needs to take that into account. So the idea that it all can be done through upbringing, no parent continues to believe that when their second child is born. They think exactly the same thing and the child turns out differently. What genetic research does show is that with rare exceptions, genes are not deterministic. They are very important, they make a difference, sometimes a very strong difference, sometimes a very weak difference, and that also the genetic research has made it clear that if one's going to put a figure on it, that roughly half the variation among children is attributable to genes and about half to the environment. I mean, there's nothing magical about that, but it's a lot of both. And what the genetic research, particularly in the last decade or so, has added in is that we shouldn't think of partitioning it into what is genes and what is environment, because the two work together so often. Gene-environment interactions most obviously show that, but so do gene-environment correlations. So it's less polarized than used to be the case. Epigenetics is the new child on the block, and it's not clear quite where that will lead. What is clear is that epigenetic changes are found in a wide range of species, nothing particularly human about this. The questions that I raised at the Sackler Symposium was, granted that this occurs, granted that it occurs with more or less any kind of experience of any significance, but how does it affect the outcome in terms of behavior or psychology? That we don't know about. That's answerable, but it hasn't yet been answered.
Can you, for the benefit of those of us who aren't perfectly clear what epigenetics is, give a very simple example which would summarize it?
Well, epigenetics is concerned with the changes, as it were, that aren't genetics, but yet affect the genes. So that the dramatic examples in the literature, well, let me use the one which is rarely used, but it's, to my mind, the most striking. Is the colour of flamingos due to their diet or their genes? Well, the answer is yes, to both. You can feed pigeons with fish till the cows come home, and they'll never turn pink. On the other hand, flamingos who are not on that diet don't ever go pink either. So it is very much a combination. And there are serious studies done in relation to diet, for example, looking at what epigenetics does there. So it's made us realize that these changes, which are chemical changes that take place, influence gene expression. That's to say, they influence how the genes operate. And interestingly, although more controversially, they can be very persistent even into the next generation sometimes. Now, that's a very surprising thing, and we don't really know how solid that evidence is, and insofar as it is solid, how common that occurs. But it's clearly a powerful experience, a biological experience that we need to know more about.
Well, the only example I can think of is to do with food. It's to do with early nutritional deprivation.
Yes.
Which has some great or some negative effect, I'm not sure. If you have very little to eat when you're young, you will later suffer. Is that correct?
Well, sort of. I mean, the thing that is interesting about whether you're subnourished or supernourished is the change with time. So that all of us are in an age where overeating is our problem, if we have a problem. But in infancy and around the time of birth, it's the opposite way round. The risk for coronary artery disease and diabetes and that sort of thing comes from undernourishment. So what is that all about? Well, it's about the fact that biologically speaking, the organism, meaning our bodies, including the brain, are programmed to deal with the experiences they encounter. And the difficulties come when your very early experiences are the opposite of those you have in midlife. And then it all turns turtle.
Right, so in that sense, the fact that Jack, who's obviously very small, he hasn't been fed as well as he would have been outside, you may have to write a sequel.
Jack's crisis with obesity in midlife. One thing that's so interesting in your work is where you talk about factors that are not absolute goods or bad, but it depends. For instance, you can't say, is childcare a good thing? It may be great if it's getting the child out of a home where they're not getting enough stimulus, but it might be less good than home would be. Similarly with adoption, you talk about how it's not an absolute good, but it may be very protective if you're being adopted out of a worse situation. So I wish we could apply that attitude to so many other of the buzzwords in parenting, you know, even say that, you know, the ongoing drama over breastfeeding. It just so happens I breastfed one and bottle fed one, and although, you know, breastfeeding is meant to be, you know, the good, I have to say bottle feeding is great for co-parenting. You can really share the parenting with the bottle the way you can't with the breast. So I wish on these debates we would always take the attitude of, you know, they may have good effects and bad effects in different situations. There's no absolute good in parenting.
More questions? Guy in grey t-shirt. Anyone over here? Guy in grey t-shirt.
I was just wondering whether you could comment on how maybe Jack would bring up a child later on, and whether his upbringing would change how he might bring up a child himself.
Nobody's ever asked me that. What an interesting question. I think he would probably be the most tender of hands-on fathers, but you know, he might have a panic attack when they go to the mall. So yeah, I think he will probably always have some social problems. I think the social world, it's probably a bit late to start learning the social world at 5, and so I don't think it'll ever come quite naturally to him. But at the one-to-one level of giving and receiving love and offering stability, I think he'll probably do a great job of it. And in a way, I think Jack, although I made him in many ways a typical boy in his interests and in his form of energy, I think in a way he's been raised without being very strictly gendered, because he doesn't, in his first 5 years, he doesn't have to constantly think, okay, I'm like the ones in the trousers, I'm not like the ones in the skirts. And so in a way he's quite androgynous in some ways, not just the long hair and so on, but in his mental attitude. So he's grown up modelling himself on his mother as just a loving adult. He doesn't divide the world into men and women initially. So I would imagine he'd be a great father. So these are all pure speculation.
And you mentioned actually, no, first of all, any more questions, please? Once in a lifetime opportunity.
I was just wondering, we were talking about, you were discussing sort of good little lies earlier on, and in the context of what the discussion about resilience and what children can and can't handle as well. I was wondering in terms of kind of bigger issues like, am I adopted? Is dad really my dad? Is it true I had a brother who died before I was born? Things like that. The parents might want to protect their children from the truth. What you both thought about the impact of lies?
I'd call those ones bad little lies. I think it's fine to lie about the tooth fairy. If I had a child who died before the others or something, I would build that in as a comforting fairy tale from the beginning. I'd be like, there's the picture of your little brother who went to heaven. You know, I'd build it in so it feels safe.
Sorry.
Well, yeah, I would. I'd make a package of it. Frankly, even when I'm telling my kids about history, I make a safe package of it. We spent a lot of time in the south of France, and you'd come to these, memorials where people had been gunned down by the Nazis, and I'd say, well, that's where they had a dreadful battle, and then the Nazis ran away. I simplified radically, but I told them about these harmful, these frightening elements. My kids have known from the beginning that they were conceived with the help of an anonymous donor, so they will casually refer to, I must get my blue eyes from my donor. These things are not frightening if you introduce them early enough in a way that the child feels safe. You know, they're only frightening if you're called into a room at 12 and told, we have to tell you that your parents aren't your parents. You know, it's that kind of rupture, I think, that frightens children. Stories like, you know, how you were conceived or somebody dead in your family, I don't think they're necessarily frightening if you tell them right. No.
Yes, I mean, I think that the issue of white lies is really tricky, I think. So I winced a bit when you were talking about white lies being okay. I know what you mean, and I basically agree with it, but don't pass that message to those running the health service with the mid-staff's inquiry in our recent past. Lies are, on the whole, dangerous and to be avoided. Putting an oversimplified version of the truth in order to fit in with the child's age, I think that's okay. I think it's usually, even with children, dangerous, however, to say something that's actually untrue.
I'm thinking of things in the sort of magical realm. You know, when you're reading them books about fairies and then you're saying the tooth fairy will take your tooth. I think that's in a realm of fantasy, and I think most children adjust quite quickly to, at a certain age, they realise, oh, that's not literal. Santa Claus doesn't literally come down the chimney.
No, I agree.
But that's very different to lies in real life.
Yeah.
You know?
May I interject? I have a child who will not lie, and it's a real social nuisance. She won't sign letters, love, and she won't say thank you for something that she's not particularly grateful for. So on that note, I wanted to thank both our speakers, Professor Sir Michael Rutter and Emma Donoghue, for giving me, and I hope you too, the most astonishing insight into how their minds work and how they have applied those minds to the things which trouble, interest, and affect us on a daily basis. I can't think of a better argument for putting scientists and novelists together in the same room, and I want to thank the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Literature for allowing us all to do this.